And hello everyone, and welcome to this UKCCSRC webinar. I am Mitchell Fajardi and I'll be chairing today. Our speaker today is Clair Gough, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester. And she will take us through the latest net zero report as well as recent findings from the Fab Ggr project. So I think you're all familiar with the structure of the webinar. Claire will be talking for about 30 minutes and questions can be asked in the chat box and will be answered at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Claire.
Hi, okay, yes, thanks Matilda, and thanks to the UKCCSRC for inviting me to close the Autumn Webinar Series. I think it's a real privilege to follow some of the great speakers that they've had so far in the webinar series. I've really enjoyed all of them. So it's great to be part of that group of speakers. So yes, meeting net zero and the role of CCS. My name is Clair Gough. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Tyndall Centre in Manchester, as Matilda's just introduced. So just a background to the Tyndall Centre, we're a distributed research centre across 4 universities in the UK. This is our 20th year, so this was supposed to be our year of having lots of events to celebrate Tyndall at 20, so watch out for next year when we'll be 21, and so we'll have an even bigger party hopefully. So yes, we do lots of interdisciplinary research, from everything looking at analysing emissions levels and reductions, carbon budgets, to the kind of social science, policy and governance side, and everything in between. So that's the Tyndall Centre. So I think when I agreed to do this talk, talking to Caris, she was really keen for me to talk about some of the work of a publication that's been put together by a group in Manchester called Policy at Manchester, which is it's like our evidence-based policy unit that pulls together work from across the university to make it in a kind of policy accessible format. So there was one a couple of years ago called On Energy, which was very successful. So then they thought it would be good to do one called On Net Zero. And so this report, it's got 10 chapters overall. I'm going to just briefly kind of touch on the ones in orange there on explaining net zero, offsetting and CO2 removal. But just to show you the kind of breadth of work that's presented in this, I'd urge you to have a look at it. I think they've put the link to it in the chat page, but it's very, very accessible and covers quite a wide range of perspectives on reaching net zero from different sectors across the economy. So net zero. So this chapter was written by my director at Tyndall Manchester, Carly McLaughlin. I think it's been really interesting that the whole kind of net zero framing and how that's grown in the past couple of years, really, with the UK being the first country to set the net zero target for 2050 in law last year. I think the kind of concept's really taken off and it's been embraced at lots of levels of organisations, cities, regions, countries. But quite often I don't think it's really kind of unpacked what we mean by net zero. So in orange at the top of that, it is literally a balance between your remaining emissions and your greenhouse gas removals, the amount to which you can remove CO2 from the atmosphere to balance those remaining emissions and bring you down to net zero. And I think it's really important that balance is always made explicit and that both sides of that, the sustainability of both sides of that is considered. So that's the first thing. And the reason we need to have the greenhouse gas removals is because it won't be possible to get all sectors down to zero. Now, obviously, there's controversies around that over which emissions you can reduce and which you can't. But certainly, for example, if you think about agriculture, there's not a lot of kind of technological means of reducing the emissions. We can't reduce demand down to zero. So there will always be some residual emissions. So to get down to zero and to be consistent with carbon budgets that are consistent with the Paris Agreement, some form of greenhouse gas removal will be required. So each chapter, they're quite short, they're quite punchy, it sets out the background and then comes up with some recommendations. So the recommendations around this chapter kind of refer to what I said about the scale, and that all actors need to really push as close to zero as possible. This is something that will recur through this talk. It's really, really important that you don't use the concept of net zero to offset what you can't be bothered to sort out or what's too difficult, to actually really think about getting everything as close to zero across the board. And that will mean that some organisations may need to become net negative to balance those that have got remaining residual emissions. And that also means that both the emissions reduction and GGR efforts need to be central all kind of new policies as we're developing new policies. So we've got a new agriculture bill that's going through the House of Lords at the moment, it's an environment bill coming, and our land use policies, there's the environmental land use management strategy, as we think about kind of moving towards post-Brexit and post-COVID policies. And we need to design our GGR as well as our emissions to maximise our co-benefits on health, well-being and prosperity. So it's about not making other things worse as you're trying to make one thing better. So that's the kind of introduction to net zero. And that introduces us to the idea of offsetting. And my colleagues, John Broderick, Joe Blakely and Matthew Paston, John Broderick's ex-Tyndall, the other two from elsewhere in the university, wrote the chapter about offsetting and thinking about how that needs to change as we move towards a net zero world. So traditionally, offsets have been a way of supporting other mitigation projects and allowing organisations to invest in projects elsewhere that match the carbon reductions equivalent to their carbon impact. But it's really important that that doesn't enable high emitters to continue with high emitting business as usual policies. And that's a really critical part when you're thinking about offsetting schemes. Again, quite a controversial area. And that the promise of GGR shouldn't be used as a means of justifying existing patterns of consumption. And again, here we must always keep that focus on getting emissions down to zero and not use offsetting as to reduce the incentive to transform energy systems. So the recommendations looking forward as we go towards net zero would be that offsetting would only take the form of a removal directly from the atmosphere. It's not about supporting other mitigation efforts, it's actually about making those greenhouse gas removals happen. And then we should really have a conversation about which emissions we allow to remain positive. And that makes you think about aviation, for example. There's lots of arguments around levels of growth, levels of kind of stabilising or restricting our aviation. That's a hugely controversial area that always comes up when you're talking around offsetting. So then to the chapter about greenhouse gas removal. So this was the one that I wrote with my colleague Andrew Wellfall, who knows a lot about the bioenergy side of things. I obviously know about this kind of CCS side of things. So there's that statement again, every chapter says this, we mustn't reduce the imperative for reducing our emissions. And when we're thinking about greenhouse gas removals, there's lots of different approaches. I think afforestation and BECCS are the most well-known, they're the ones that have gone into the IPCC scenarios to the greatest extent. But broadly speaking, they fit into two categories of where you're storing your carbon, whether it's in a land-based situation or in a geological storage formation. And clearly, it's really important in this that we have permanent storage, that we can demonstrate additionality, that it is an additional removal, not something that's already been counted in kind of carbon budgets, and that we can quantify those reductions. And when you're thinking about those characteristics, I think there's clear advantages of geological storage. So our recommendations around that are that we really need to concentrate on establishing CCS in the industrial clusters. That's really critical to establishing BECCS and DACs. And then in Orange, I've just added, yesterday the National Infrastructure Strategy was produced. So I've just kind of picked up out of the 10-point plan that was announced this week, what's said in that about. So that's really kind of accelerating this ambition towards 4 CCS clusters by the end of the decade, with 2 to begin in the mid-2020s. So that's slightly changing the language, making the language a little bit more vague. Before it was around low carbon and net zero. So that's just become CCS clusters. And that is increasing the ambition with a further quantified ambition to capture 10 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year by 2030. So that's encouraging. There's quite a large budget that's been associated with that, but we don't have any detail on what that means. But clearly that fits in well with the current industrial decarbonisation challenge. And then looking at the kind of land use side of things, this is Andrew's work. So I think one of the things that's really important around here is that we maximise how we use our land, but also make the most of our opportunities to get biomass energy resources from waste and residues across all the sectors. And that's something that the modelling shows that we're really underusing that resource at the moment. And then we hear a lot about tree planting and afforestation. That was also in the 10-point plan. We've got an England tree strategy coming out next year. And it's not just a case of tree planting. Any forestry and sustainable forest management just needs to be properly managed. The trees grow taking different amounts of carbon at different points in the growth cycle. It's not a case of just planting the trees and walking away. You've got to manage those forests, manage it for the carbon, and that's part of ensuring your long-term carbon storage. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the On Net Zero report. Do go and have a look at it. There's lots of interesting stuff in there. Coming to the title of the talk, Meeting Net Zero and the Role of CCS, if we look at that balance of emissions reduction and greenhouse gas removal, I think it's clear that CCS has quite a significant role to play in both of those areas. So in terms of getting emissions down to zero, we talked about the CCS clusters. So most of you will be familiar, the UKCCSRC has funded a project that my colleague Sarah Mander and I are doing at Manchester on social licence to operate at CCS and the role of clusters in delivering that. I'm not going to talk about that so much today. I've talked to within the kind of biannual meetings previously, and I think we're planning a seminar after Christmas at some point to present our results on that. And then looking at the greenhouse gas removal side, I thought it would be interesting to present to this group some of the work that we've been doing on that. And that can be the role of carbon storage and geological storage in that is around both biomass energy with CCS and direct air capture. Both require storage and depend on establishing that CCS infrastructure. So the two are linked, and CCS clearly has a big role to play in delivering net zero. So this brings us to the Fab Ggr project, which stands for Feasibility of Afforestation and BECCS for greenhouse gas removal. So this is a 4-year project that we're just over halfway through, funded by the Greenhouse Gas Removal Research Programme led by NERC. It's led by my colleague Nem Vaughan at UEA with colleagues at Exeter, Aberdeen and Aston. So broadly speaking, we're looking at real world feasibility and the consequences of both afforestation and BECCS. Focusing on those two approaches at the moment for these were the most important ones in the IAMs at the time that we were putting the bid together, and we wanted to focus on those because of the kind of biomass side of things as well. And there's lots of aspects to the project, looking at how we can actually quantify how much the emissions reduction potential and carbon dioxide removal potential is from those two approaches, and looking at how those fit in terms of the wider climate impacts, different climate scenarios, how that affects our ability to deliver these approaches, what the impact on ecosystem services provision might be around the economics and the policy and the social and governance related uncertainties. And one of the key things that we're looking at here is we're doing it on a supply chain basis. So not looking at a kind of vague notional concepts of BECCS and afforestation, but actually looking at how we might be delivering those approaches and looking at those across a range of scales from the UK up to kind of global modelling scales. So I'm not going to present results across the whole project. I'm going to focus on the two areas that I've had most involvement in so far. A lot of that revolves around opening up and broadening the discussion around feasibility of these two approaches. So we've had 2 stakeholder workshops, and I want to present the results of both of those. The first one we held really only a few weeks after the project was announced, the contract was signed. So it was really at the very, very start of things. We hadn't kind of got all our kind of whole research program worked out, and we really wanted to have the stakeholders have input to how we designed the content of that, of the project going forward, and build up our stakeholder community. We've also, part of that was defining what supply chains we were going to explore across the project. And that's fed into a life cycle assessment of the supply chains, and then also further stakeholder analysis and multi-criterion mapping of those supply chains. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I should stress that I can't take credit for all of this work at all. So my colleague Johanna Forster at UEA has led the work on the first stakeholder workshop. So the top publication there is writes up the kind of full details of that workshop. And then my colleague Deirdre Cleary led on the second workshop and has just submitted a paper reporting on that. And then the life cycle assessment work was done by Samira Garcia Freites at Manchester and Miriam Roda at Aston. And again, that was submitted a few weeks ago. So I'm going to just present an overview of those last 2 pieces of work prior to publication. So the stakeholder workshop in 2017, there were kind of 2 three broad areas to how we organise this workshop. We did an overall issue mapping process to look at what the key issues were around delivering greenhouse gas removal with these approaches, and what the feasibility, what criteria might sort of judge the feasibility of those approaches. And then we also did, as I've mentioned, the supply chain work, which I'll come into in the next slide. So overall, we found that mapping these responses, the participants did have quite a holistic view of the issues. So we had these mapping processes, and everything was then transcribed and coded using NVivo. And we identified 12 broad themes and 61 sub-themes within that. And we found a broad spread of participants all mentioned issues across a full range of those themes. I'm not going to go into the details of this table, but we tried to sort of map who was talking about what issues across by their different areas of expertise, across kind of bioenergy and forestry communities, CCS communities, climate change, and then looking around kind of policy, NGO and business sectors to see who was talking about what. So that's just one area of analysis that we've done with that. And then the other thing we did with the feasibility, the results of the feasibility issues that we identified was we went and compared with one of the integrated assessment models. So these are the large global models that inform mitigation scenarios for the IPCC, and looked at the extent to which these different issues were represented in the integrated assessment models, and graded those according to whether they were that representation was limited, moderate or extensive. And then we tried to consider the reasons why and the factors for that representation, whether it's because there were inherent uncertainties, whether there was disagreement over the data, whether it was just something that was just plain impossible to model, and worked with Detlev van Voren on the image model to kind of validate that our kind of assessment of that process. So that was a really interesting result. And what we found, not surprisingly, was that the societal and governance aspects of feasibility are currently quite underrepresented. Some of the kind of real world complexities not well captured, particularly around competing human needs for resources and the justice and ethics dimensions, but also the importance of temporal and spatial scale, particularly in how that greenhouse gas accounting is modelled in these integrated assessment models. And as a result of that, we identified some complementary approaches that could help to inform the understanding that comes out of the models. And I think this is not a new thing. Since for the past 30 or so years since integrated assessment models have been used, there have been calls to expand those, and that's sort of, those voices sort of died down a little bit, I think, over the 20 years or so ago. But then I think that the model is now a sort of also supporting that need to kind of have these wider voices speaking with the models. So the next thing we did within this first workshop was we proposed 4 or 5 BECCS and afforestation supply chain routes to delivering greenhouse gas removal with these approaches, and put those to the stakeholders to get feedback on what was most sensible to look at, what would be most interesting, what would be most useful for the project, looking at delivering BECCS in the UK. We took those comments, worked together as a project team, and came up with 3 BECCS scenarios to extend the further analysis, and an afforestation route, which I'm not going to go into here, just for the sake of time and to keep focus on the CCS side of things. So we had 3 modular supply chains that all moved from the kind of feedstock production up as far as this kind of storage end. So in all of the supply chains, the orange boxes are the biomass end, and the blue are the energy conversion and CCS part of things. So we had a power supply chain delivering electricity from imported residues from the US, from a sawmill, going into a post-combustion CCS power plant. We then had a small-scale combined heat and power plant using energy crop miscanthus grown in the UK with post-combustion CCS. And then we had a hydrogen supply chain based on short rotation coppice willow through to an integrated gasification combined cycle pre-combustion CCS to deliver hydrogen for power. So what we did with these supply chains, we've got other parts of the project that are looking at the feedstock production and the potential for different yields under different climate scenarios, for example, as well. So there's other aspects being looked at. But these went into a life cycle assessment of each of the supply chain, looking at kind of process modelling and the broader life cycle assessment. That was Samira and Miriam's work. And then we also, DMID undertook a multi-criteria mapping process, which involved interviews with stakeholders, followed by a stakeholder workshop, trying to speak to some of the same people who were at the first workshop and get some continuity through there. And in these interviews, they assessed the feasibility according to their own defined feasibility criteria, and then did a scaling assessment in the workshop at how we might scale up these supply chains. So from the feasibility process and the multi-criteria mapping, there were 9 themes broadly that came up, and out of those, a large number of sub-themes were brought together. And these ones in orange are ones that didn't come up when we were looking in the first workshop, when we were looking at the kind of general conceptual idea of BECCS more kind of in the abstract. And so you can see there's a lot more detail when you start looking at how you actually are going to deliver. And I'll come on to the sort of how well the different supply chains performed against these, but you can see the sorts of details that came in around there, around business models, around the impact of climate and location, land use issues, etc. So bringing those 2 strands of analysis together, we've got 3 supply chains down the side. Looking at the stakeholder assessment, there was a lot of detail in this. So this is a very, very high level overview that I'm doing. So these are where there was broad consensus on the criteria, and there's a lot of detail in between and quite large range. So participants were asked to kind of give pessimistic with optimistic scores against the feasibility criteria. So you can see that the power supply chain, power and residue supply chain performed well over kind of the availability of land to deliver it. It's a high technology readiness, and over the temporal scale in terms of the ability to deliver greenhouse gas removals in the short term. But performed less well in terms of the incentives and financial sustainability. That's around kind of the long-term incentives and the ability to kind of move between crops should the need arise, and environmental sustainability. So some of that's around the kind of distance of shipping, importing the residues. The small-scale CHP supply chain performed much better in terms of the incentives and financial sustainability, and the temporal scale in terms of delivering greenhouse gas removal quickly, but less well in terms of environmental sustainability, its impact on carbon budget because it's small scale, and availability of land to deliver the energy crops. The hydrogen supply chain did well on the incentive side and the financial side, and did very well on the environmental sustainability side, but is at a much lower technology readiness level and ability to deliver greenhouse gas removal in the shorter term. Did less well on the temporal scale. And then if we look down the last column, that's when that was a separate study when we're looking at the kind of modelling and doing a proper quantified analysis, is that you can cut this different ways. So the power and residues can deliver the highest annual greenhouse gas removal rates. It's because it produces is on a much greater scale. But if you actually look at its effectiveness per megawatt hour, it performed the least well of the 3. But this high capacity factor gives it the greatest potential GGR delivery. The smaller scale one with its lower capacity factor, less impacts on carbon budgets. And it's been really nice to see how the quantified modelling assessment marries up against the stakeholder assessment. And as I say, both of these papers have only just been finished, so we need to do that proper analysis now and actually compare across the 2. That's not something that I've only just started doing for this talk, so we haven't got a lot of data on this yet, but I think it's going to be really exciting to look at that. So that performed, the CHP supply chain performed best when you look at it against per unit megawatt hour and per land area per hectare. And then in the middle, the hydrogen supply chain was a GGR potential per megawatt hour sort of closer to the power one, but a much higher GGR in terms of the greenhouse gas removals per tonne of biomass input. So that's the kind of numerical analysis on the supply chains. On the going back to the stakeholder workshop, the next thing we did was we looked at potential bottlenecks in terms of scaling up. So delivering these supply chains at a UK scale compatible with the kind of aspirations for greenhouse gas removal, but also up to a global scale. And we asked the participants to kind of identify particular crunch points and things that might affect the scale up. And so we see obviously issues around land availability and ownership become more important as you scale up, where you grow the biomass. Potentially competition for CCS infrastructure with other technologies such as direct air capture, and indeed non-greenhouse gas removal applications of CCS need to look out for that. Resilience to future climate impacts, and that's something that's been looked at elsewhere in the project in terms of modelling yield potentials across the globe and across the UK. Skills gaps in terms of establishing the supply chains at scale. And as we do increase the scale, you potentially increase the length and complexity of supply chains in an international context as well. And so the kind of governance side and the risk sharing side along the supply chain becomes more complex. So to summarise the work of this part of the Fab Ggr project, I think it's been really interesting to see how the analysis, starting at this kind of the very abstract level of BECCS, both in terms of conceptually, but also in terms of the global integrated assessment modelling, that you get additional uncertainties when you start to look at a more granular level. And there's certainly more work to be done there, but that's been a really interesting finding of those particular uncertainties. And we need to be much more place-based. It matters where you put the different elements of these supply chains and consider them much more conceptually. And that's something that we hope to do going forwards as well. And also the value of bringing in more voices. That's something that we've talked about many times. We've looked at some of the kind of more civil society side of things also being looked at across the project. Colleagues at UEA are looking at the social and the governance and political issues around it as well, which I haven't got time to report on here. So just to give you a flavour of some of the publications that we've done on this, there's many more from across other parts of the project, but just to highlight, so that there's my colleague Laurie Waller led a paper on different framings of greenhouse gas removal in relation to feasibility, and there's more work coming out of that group as well. There's Johanna's paper on the first stakeholder workshop. There's two that's been submitted, and then there's some more light reading that I've been involved in around BECCS in the context of both integrated assessment modelling and also the kind of social science side of things. So that's all my slides now. I'm very happy to take questions. I haven't rushed through that too quickly and skim over things, but that's the end of the slides.
Thank you, Claire. Very insightful. I think the two projects that you presented are really complement each other very well. And yes, very interesting insights as to GGR potential mapping and what we need to design better GGR policies. So we'll now move to questions. I see there's no questions in the chat yet. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand and speak directly. And as you warm up, I actually wrote a lot of questions myself. I found the presentations. Okay. Yes, John? Oh, okay. Now I guess that was a mistake. Okay, so if there's no questions at the moment, my first question is on the net zero report and on the recommendation of offsetting only in the form of removal. So this is something that we've seen in other recommendations, for example, in the Oxford principles. And so this means withdrawing support for mitigation projects in favor of removal projects, which I think is great if all companies commit to reduce emissions to their absolute minimum prior to buying removal offsets. But if this is not respected, is there a risk that prioritizing carbon removal offsets actually lead to less mitigation in favor of more removal? And I mean, this is kind of a devil advocate's question, but I don't know if you have a opinion on this.
Yeah, I kind of agonized over that slide a little bit because partly because it's not my work, presenting the work of my colleagues, John Broderick et al. And I'm not sure that those would have been my conclusions necessarily about prioritizing GGR. I think it's good to have in your mind that that's where we needed to be heading before, but I think clearly there's a journey to get to that point. And I think, you know, if it's a way of of getting funds towards GGR projects, or it's a way of increasing the mitigation, I think we need to recognise that it's not going to happen overnight. So that's why I kind of put that thing that as we move towards a net zero world, that's where we need to be. But I think it is a hugely controversial area, and one that I've sort of tried to avoid, I think, so far, just being a coward about it. And it is hugely complex as well. So that's not really answering your questions, that's ducking out of it a little bit.
No, but it was a devil advocate's question, so that's fine. There's a question from Phoebe Bonilla. Phoebe, do you want to ask your question directly? And sorry if I mispronounce your name. If you want to unmute yourself.
No mic.
Oh yes, don't have a mic. So the question is, are the stakeholders going to hear from the modeling and analysis? I was wondering if that could shift their criteria.
So that was the plan, was that we would have all the life cycle assessment work done before the second stakeholder workshop, and to actually confront them with the results. So in that workshop, we didn't have the detailed analysis, but we had some headline statements from it and some kind of summary data from it, and they had the opportunity to comment on that, but we haven't kind of processed all of that data yet. But yes, the results were presented to the stakeholders, and they will get reports from it all as we go forward. Whether or not that would change the criteria, so some of them, so the first set of feasibility criteria were voiced at the first workshop, and we presented those criteria in the interviews, and there was the opportunity to change and adapt those criteria. So as I say, some of the interviewees were at both workshops and were interviewed and at the workshop, so they did have the opportunity to change those criteria, and that's why we kind of identified some of the novel themes that emerged from that. So that's a kind of yes and no answer. So yes, if they did change their criteria a bit, but not on the basis of the detailed numbers, which we've only just finished analysing, but they did have some of the data and we did get feedback on. So we had a poster up from all of the work packages at the workshop, and invited comments on all of the results that we got at that point. So very much we did want feedback on the results, yeah.
I have a lot of questions on the Fab Ggr project actually, so I'll just keep going. I find it sometimes difficult to quantify and monetize ecosystem services. So could you tell us more about which ecosystem services are modeled and how?
I'll try. So this is Brett Day's work at Exeter, so not my work. And so they've got a GIS model of the UK, and they're exploring different locations for where they grow the feedstock, and then kind of cutting that along different parameters, whether they're prioritising landscape services, they've got a flood management and biodiversity. So those are the sorts of areas that they're looking at, and showing different maps of how you would prioritise where you locate your biomass according to those different ecosystem services provisions. So that's Exeter that are doing that work. So I should say Fab Ggr has got a website which has got links to all the different aspects of the work.
Yeah, I'll be sure to look at that in detail.
If you Google Fab Ggr, then it comes to it.
Very good. Question from John. John, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's just sort of straightforwardly. What do farmers think about BECCS?
Well,
the decent version, please.
It depends which farmers you speak to, I guess. So the NFU have been at all of our interviews and workshops. They've been very active and very supportive. They are, so I mean, the NFU's own net zero report relies quite heavily on BECCS, their plan for how they would meet net zero, which, you know, it opens up the question about people who's net negative and who's net zero, and who counts the BECCS as their greenhouse gas removal against their emissions. That's the whole offsetting question. I think, I mean, there was a lot of discussion around when we were constructing the supply chains, what the feedstocks would be. And that's where the miscanthus production came in. I think we had more willow initially, and they reduced the willow. I think there was a little bit of skepticism about delivering willow because it's moving from, it's seen as forestry rather than crops. So again, it all depends on what sort of BECCS you're talking about, what feedstocks you're talking about. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
I guess so. I'm kind of thinking a bit more grassroots, really. You know,
Yeah, well, we haven't done that yet, talking to the grassroots. We've done a little bit of talking to individual farmers, and I think that's something that Laurie Waller and Tim Rayner at UEA are going to be doing more of, looking at the grassroots. That's ongoing at the moment to try and look at that level. But I think that's work that we still need to do.
Yeah.
I think on this, Emily Cox published a very nice study on the acceptability of BECCS among different groups, including farmers in the UK and the US.
Just one of the things, sorry to sort of follow on, but I think we've got a few minutes. Have you come across anything about sort of like recycling wood? In other words, you know, if you donated wood from your gardens to a wood recycling bin, you know that somebody will come along and burn it for you and catch the CO2 or anything weird like that. Because I think actually quite a lot of sort of arisings are in odd places, aren't they?
So I think that would come into the residues category, and I think yeah, Muir is here. So my colleague Muir Freer is doing a PhD looking at mapping the use of lots of different biomass feedstocks for BECCS supply chains in the UK, and really kind of trying to look at the potential for that, but also the carbon performance of those different supply chains. So Muir, I don't know if you want to say anything. I'll put you on the spot there.
That's okay, sorry about that. Yeah, no, it's really
to introduce you to this group as well.
Yeah, it's really good. I hadn't really thought about having community-led derived residues, but I think that is a really, really good idea. But mostly looking at your feedstocks from quite far abroad and within the UK and kind of sourcing them together. But it's a really good idea to have a sort of lowercase community-led one. I like it.
I see that, John, does it answer your question?
Yes. I mean, in other words, it's sort of not happening yet, I guess, is the answer. And there's, I mean, obviously huge difficulties with anything like that. But,
a question from Patrick. Patrick, do you want to ask your question? Randall.
Yes, thank you, Matilda. Thank you, Claire. Fantastic presentation. So I have to admit, I'm not a social scientist, so I'm far away. The last bit that I remember, though, before COVID, we had a biannual where David showed us that from a set of, let's say, Cambridge University environment students, most of them did not know what CCS was. And then you showed a figure early on that the set of stakeholders that you were interviewing 100% says, oh, it's very technical. So I was wondering, is this representative of the general public?
So were the stakeholders that we spoke to?
Yes.
No. They were, I mean, experts. They were all expert in areas of bioenergy, CCS, climate change, climate policy. So this was very much not looking at members of the public. There is a lot of work going on around the kind of public perceptions. BEIS has got a public perceptions process going on at the moment. Well, they've just finished doing the meetings around that. They're just working on the data from that. There's a little bit on the climate assembly results. Emily's done a lot of work on this, and we've also done some work on it as well. But this was very much looking at experts and people who were already kind of very immersed in the kind of CCS and BECCS subject areas.
Great, thank you. Can't wait to see the difference between the general public and the experts.
Well, these are the people who will have to deliver it, yeah. So, or we'll be working out, climate policies using these approaches.
Great, thank you.
A question from Neil Rimmer. Neil, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sorry, I just had to switch network there. The issue with the bomb. Yeah, I mean, it's on the subject of the offsetting and the reporting of emissions. I mean, the companies who've been reporting emissions, it's very much self-reporting. A very limited amount of integrity or analysis is done of their actual figures. When it comes to offsetting and carbon taxes and the actual, pound sign being put against these figures, can we rely on anybody's figures in terms of accuracy? Because how much is being sort of set to one side, not ours, not ours, not ours, and how much, the hard to abate emissions or the ones that just slip through the cracks will be a concern unless we have a way of really auditing people truly and accurately.
Yeah, I think that's a huge area. So the whole kind of area of monitoring and reporting and verification needs properly working out and hasn't as yet. So one of the things that I've been involved in with Nem Vaughan recently is with the Committee on Climate Change working towards the 6th carbon budget. We've run a policy roundtable to try and look at what needs to be incorporated in new and existing policies to make GGR work within the kind of climate policies and the net zero policy. And that is a huge part of it, actually establishing both the kind of means of accounting for greenhouse gas removal, but also the specific means of verifying and estimating the actual greenhouse gas removals that come from different approaches, and it will be different for all approaches. So doing your greenhouse gas accounting from a forest is going to be very different to doing it from your miscanthus production, for example, and that all needs working out. I don't think that has been done yet. Yeah,
that's the same. I mean, the first people to take on, if you take the Brewdog example, buy a bunch of land, etc., and plant forest, but not everybody can do that. And how much you actually get for that is going to be variable year on year because it's not a fixed figure. You're not versus sequestrating geologically. Even then, you've got to have factors of slippage, etc. But when it comes to agricultural, disposal, shall we say, of CO2, it's variable on the season as to what you've actually truly removed.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons making that distinction between geological storage and land-based or biological storage is that seasonal variation, but also the issue of permanence and long-term. So long-term for a geologist is obviously a very different thing to long-term to almost everybody else potentially, but that becomes really important when you're using it against your kind of carbon budgets looking to 2050 and 2100. So I would say that, and then and also I think that also brings in the point around how you incentivize and how you set your targets for greenhouse gas removal, and making those, there's a case for separating the targets so that you don't have a single organization striving for net zero. You've got to really maximize your greenhouse gas removals and maximize your emissions reduction. And so if you do it on an organizational level, say for example something like the National Trust, it's probably not enough for them to be zero. They probably need to be net negative because they've got the land and they've got the potential. And so you need to really think about your accounting in those terms as well when you're setting your targets. It's not straightforward. No,
I'd say it's just, I just get the feeling that it's lagging a little bit behind in terms of we're perhaps getting close to an actual carbon tax on this without any real accurate verification of what is being reported. It's fairly limited what is done in terms of an audit of anybody's emissions right now.
Yeah, we're working on it. People are working on it, but it needs to feed into government strategy, I think, which is a bit of a slower process. Yeah.
Just wondering who's actually working on that was the slight thing. Is it actually, is it government department working on this or what?
You mean from the policy side, or in terms of, the Committee on Climate Change is certainly working on it. Pete Smith at Aberdeen is very active in this area as well. Bays are looking at it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Question from Carolina. I won't try to pronounce your last name, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Matilda. Hi, Claire. So I think you're sort of quite familiar with my research in that I also tried to speak to stakeholders and actors around BECCS, and I wondered about sort of the sampling strategy employed in your research, and if there was any particular stakeholder group in those workshops that maybe wasn't present or was maybe more difficult to get a hold of, and whether you sort of managed to speak to all the stakeholder categories that you wanted to speak to within your project. And thank you so much again for the great presentation. I should have said at the start, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. So it was a team effort at the start of really kind of brainstorming who we wanted to have in the room and who the key experts were, from drawing on the kind of knowledge across the whole team. And we really did spend a long time trying to ensure we got a really good spread of expertise that covered both kind of all the aspects of the supply chains, because they were quite technical discussions as well. So we wanted people who knew about miscanthus production, knew about willow production, knew about the CCS side of things, but also the kind of policy and accounting side of things. So we tried to get a spread of expertise. I think we took a sort of expertise focus, but we also made sure we had representatives of policy communities, and both on kind of, we had somebody that had been very involved with the IPCC, we had people from BEIS, we also had NGOs there to try and cover. I guess perhaps we didn't have the. I mean, we tried to get NGOs there. We didn't get the more sceptical voices there, but we did have Greenpeace, Woodland Trust, RSPB. We did have a fair representation of NGOs. Yeah, I don't feel that we missed anybody. I don't think there's anybody obvious that we were missing. I think we managed to get most bases covered that we wanted. I mean, if Dimi's got anything to add to that, I don't know, he was involved in the recruitment as well.
Oh yeah. I'd say, yeah, just to add to that, I think we definitely tried to cover all bases along the supply chain and from different parts of society. I'd say we definitely also tried to pick up on the forestry sort of sector, because we knew that they'd have insights in terms of what could actually be produced in the UK. So we definitely tried to get them and the farming community as well. Yeah, just to comment on John's question as well around the farming community, I think they were open. We didn't actually speak to any particular farmers, but National Farmers Union, from what I gathered, they're kind of open to the idea of using their land in different ways, but obviously they will have been using their land for like the last 20 years, probably for different uses. So it was identified as like a potential kind of hold up, but we wanted to try and capture that. But they seemed open. I think the main thing was kind of the incentives and, you know, where they're going to be long-term incentives in place, maybe some skepticism around short-term crops that might, you know, the incentives might end if a new government comes in and scraps that. Hope that helps. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Dimi.
I see two more questions. Oh, no, go for it.
Sorry, Matilda, this is awkward. I just thanks, Claire, for the answer. I just I appreciate the sort of the efforts that you had to go through to sort of cover all the bases with the different aspects from BECCS, which I know from my research, which is obviously at a much smaller scale than yours was, the I think particular differences in opinion about the challenges of scaling up BECCS across the different parts of BECCS. So thank you for answering that. And sorry, Matilda, for awkwardly jumping in there.
No problem. A question from Niall McFadden.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm involved with the Climate Emergency Task Force for Cheshire West, and we're just reviewing the land policy. At the moment, we emit 340 kilotons of greenhouse gas equivalent, CO2 equivalent. And so most of the land is used for cows. And I just wonder, since we're hopefully get one of the CCS plants in Cheshire West, whether it makes more economic sense to be growing willow or miscanthus when we're very close to a CCS plant, or whether the transport doesn't really matter.
No, the transport definitely matters. That's a big part of it. In fact, that's probably the highest carbon part of the supply chain in terms of where you locate your different parts of the supply chain is the biomass transportation, and that's something that Muir's been working on. But the results presented here from the life cycle assessment also kind of back that up as well. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Muir.
No, you're right on the money there. I found that it's probably more important to have your BECCS facility or it's more tethered towards your biomass location rather than its cluster, as the emissions associated with the transportation of the biomass is so much higher than the CO2 transportation and potentially your energy output, depending on what it is. So,
apparently HyNet has got planning permission for the BECCS plant as well. So,
all right.
We have another question from Mai.
About now, is the sound work?
Yes.
So thanks for a great talk, Claire, and thank you, Mathilde, for sharing. So, so my question, so right now I'm working with the power sector and in terms of doing some demonstration studies on CO2 capture in like facilities for a power plant application. And there's questions about in terms of the reporting and the timeframes in which they need to report their emissions. So, you know, we're doing sort of dynamic studies. So there's like sort of minute by minute calculations of CO2 emissions. And they're saying, do we need to report this on a 30-minute basis or a daily basis? And trying to synchronize this with the GGR technologies and their accounting methods, which might be on a more yearly basis, is something that I think policy might need to think about and try to synchronize. So from the emitter side, like their reporting may be on smaller timeframes, on sort of, you know, half an hour or even daily basis. And then the GGR technologies are more on the yearly basis. And how do we kind of work together to try to synchronize the timings of those two systems? And I think in terms of offsetting, that's kind of quite important, I think, in the policy design. And I mean, do you know if is anyone working on this this piece of sort of framework development at all?
Not that I know about. It's a really good point, and it's something I've not thought about actually. And I think it's really important as the number of and variety of GGR approaches diversifies, which it surely will. All those sorts of issues. There'll be other similar issues around kind of temporal and different reporting constraints along the variety of GGR approaches. Definitely, I think that's a really, really good point. I've made a note of it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Is there any more questions from the audience? If not, I think this nicely concludes this webinar. Thank you, Claire, for such an insightful presentation, and thank you for everyone for the active participation and discussion.
Thank you. Perfect timing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Claire and Mathilde as well for chairing. If I could just add just before everybody leaves, this is the last session, so thanks again, Claire. We will be back on the 28th of January, so keep an eye on our social channels and our newsletter and our website for announcements about that. But thank you very much again, and we hope to see some of you again in January. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Mathilde. That was great.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Paris. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you.